Thank you, Madam Chairman. I appreciate those answers. You guys gave me so much to discuss here. I don't even know where to begin. I might start by questioning the notion about whether we should be choosing between freedom of competition and freedom of contract. I like all freedom. I don't want to specify which type of freedom we should be restricting. The note that it was noted that sometimes these are offered to employees after they're already hired on a take it or leave it basis. But a take it or leave it basis is, in fact, still a private contract. And employees have the same right. I mean, an employee can walk into their employment and employer and say, I can only work on Tuesdays now. Can I still keep my job? And the employer's got a take it or leave it decision to make. That's part of doing business as free citizens and adults in a free market country, which I would argue we don't have a free market country any longer, and it's partly because of policies like the one that's before us today. And these are, in fact, agreements, and the title of the bill acknowledges that they're agreements that are signed by parties, and I completely understand the motivation behind this bill. I totally get it that if we were talking about very low income, entry level jobs, maybe non-competes are being used in some sort of nefarious way, and maybe we can get at that at somehow. But when you're talking about people that make, as I was mentioned, around $90,000 and up, generally speaking, they're intelligent people, and they know when they are being hired for a job what the terms of that employment are. And my concern about this is not only taking away the freedom of my bosses, because that's what we're doing. We're telling the people that we work for that we don't respect them enough for them to get into their own decision making. But you're also going to stifle economic opportunity. And I'll just give you an example, and I'm looking for a reaction on this too. My personal experience is that I was an insurance producer when I was in my 20s. I used to be an independent insurance agent, and I'd travel around and knock on doors. My very first day on the job, I went to the mall. I went to every store in the mall and talked to everybody who worked there and tried to get them to let me quote their auto and homeowners insurance. But I signed a non-compete agreement with my employer, and it was under the understanding that, I'm going to be given an opportunity here to learn this industry and go out and make money and establish myself and build a base of customers. But in exchange for that, my boss owns the customers. And I was happy with that. And I signed my agreement with him willingly. And I certainly didn't make anywhere near the numbers that we're talking about when I first started in that industry. I don't know that I ever reached even 90 grand back then. But the point is, I would not have been able to have that job, and that industry would not have even existed in those terms, and that opportunity would not have occurred if it were not for two willing citizens who knew full well what they were doing, being able to engage in that activity. So for some experts to come along and advise the government to use the force of government to tell people they can't enter into a voluntary private contract, to me, is an absurdity in America. And all of the arguments withstanding about protections and so forth, no one needs to be protected from themselves in the case of exercising their freedom. This is before us, and the reason why it's a big issue for me and why I'm speaking up on it is because of what's happened in recent years in the homemaker or provider, Medicaid provider area. I'm trying to think of the exact term, but home health aides, that kind of thing, where we have effectively done tremendous damage to an entire industry by suggesting that they can't use non-competes. That business model works like this. They hire people, many of them without any experience whatsoever, and train them and place them with a family who pays the agency, who then pays the employee for their services. And the business does a tremendous amount of good because they are creating a mechanism in the marketplace to provide a service that wouldn't otherwise exist, training people, giving recourse to consumers. They're creating a lot of things, and they're also creating a job opportunity for someone. when you say that those people cannot have non-compete agreements with their employees, what you're doing is you're opening up the door for those employees to make contracts with the families they're placed with right after they were placed, and essentially cutting out the people that provided for that connection in the first place. And what happens then is that connection disappears and the people that are in that industry disappear, and then the whole thing disappears. And I think that's the danger here, is that if we pass a law like this, eliminating even more opportunities for freedom between private citizens to engage in this activity, we will end up with more. So I would like a reaction to the home health aid arena, where people are probably making somewhere in the maybe $40,000 to $70,000 a year ranges would be a approximate guess of mine. But they're getting a job opportunity, they're getting training, and they're getting access to something that they wouldn't otherwise have. And I think it's a benefit to our society and the people that are served by those workers. Through you, Madam President.
Thank you, Senator Sampson. I do want to remind all of our committee members, we have 87 people signed up today, and I appreciate questions and probing, but I think we should probably reserve our argument to the committee meeting. So I would encourage folks to do that, all of us, to restrain ourselves. I know we have a lot on our mind and strong opinions on these matters. I'm not sure that our witnesses are familiar with the Connecticut state law on homemaker and companions, and the prohibition does exist on non-competes. However, they are allowed to ask employees to sign non-solicitation agreements, I believe, and so that is something that is a significant. It significantly restricts the ability of a person hired by the agency to bring their clients with them if they were to move to a different agency, or to, as some have suggested, work independently for that client. So, but I don't know if our experts are familiar with Connecticut state law in this area, or if Patrick Hewlin, if Mr. Hewlin, you want to respond.
Sure, I'll just respond quickly, and you know, the panelists can offer any input if they wish. But basically, I think this bill takes an I think the important approach of kind of carving out non-solicitation agreements and making clear that businesses can protect the key interest there, right? Which you mentioned, Senator Sampson, and thank you for those comments. That businesses can protect their customer base, but they can't. They can do that through the direct action of protecting the customer base, right? It isn't about preventing the worker from moving jobs, which as Professor Anna Richmond said, is kind of an antitrust matter that, even under a pretty kind of aggressive capitalist framework, my understanding is that most folks think, and you can certainly feel free to disagree with me, Senator, that there's a role for antitrust enforcement and preventing enforcement of certain contracts between private parties, which I think is the right analogy here. You may disagree, that's fine. We can certainly keep talking about this topic.
Thank you very much.
May I respond as well, or is there no time?
You certainly may respond, since you were asked.
Thank you. So just a couple of points in response to the Senator's arguments and concerns. First, I just need to call out the concept of freedom of contract and freedom of competition as sort of being a universal goal for freedom in all varieties and all flavors. Unfortunately, that's just not the reality. We have 15 years of economic data that show that this is a situation where freedom of contract left to its own devices will create a race to the bottom that impedes competition. So policy is required, and it is appropriate for policymakers to make those kinds of choices when the data shows what it shows, and when those tensions and values, when those priorities and values are in tension with one another. Second, I wanted to just reiterate the point about the nature of the underlying interest and the various ways that employers can address their concerns and protect their business model besides what is clearly an over-inclusive, I dare say draconian method of dealing with the problem. There is robust protection available for loss of trade secret and misappropriation of trade secret, both at the state and federal level. In fact, we've increased penalties at the federal level and have a much more aggressive model thanks to the Defense of Trade Secrets Act in recent years. On the customer interest, yes, non-solicitation agreements are available, no business agreements are available, a variety of instruments are available, including, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, certain trading repayment clauses are permitted by this bill. It is a very light hand. And what I wanted to add to the array of options that employers have for protecting their interests is providing beneficial, competitive terms of employment to keep their workers happy in their jobs. That is sort of that ability that I alluded to before, the ability of workers to negotiate for better terms is completely eliminated. That freedom that we value, the ability of the worker to do the types of sort of bootstrapping and aggressive self-promotion that the senator described, are completely made impossible by these restraints once they're in place. And then the last thing I'll just add, and this somewhat reiterates what I said at first, is that the model that the senator describes, that employees and employers are sort of free negotiators in this picture. Ms. Gerstein sort of explained why that is not the reality. What I wanted to just add to that is it is that sort of economic image, that sort of belief or that model, which is a fair way to describe it, is what enabled non-compete law to develop the way it has, and has resulted in the permissible use under existing law, and explains the deviation from antitrust law that has permitted this exception. But what we now know is that that is not the model of how it works. And economists, the defenders of the freedom of contract principle, those that support the economic freedom that the senator described, have documented that that is not the reality of how this evolves, that this is not a knowing trade-off, and that every indicator that we might be concerned about, such as industry growth, resource, company entry, particularly this idea of new businesses and the ability to sort of, throw in and pursue that American dream and create a new entity. Those values are harmed by non-competes, and we now have the data to show that that is the case.
Thank you. I will allow Senator Sampson to make one brief comment, but I do want to encourage everyone. I would love to have an opportunity to put the three of you in a room, the four of you in a room, and we could spend all day, but we have, as I mentioned, 87. Now we're down to 84 members of the public that have asked to speak today, and I want to make sure we get to them. So if you could be brief in your closing comments.
Madam Chairman, I appreciate the opportunity, and I will be brief. But let me just point out that these bills are important, and the purpose of this public hearing is for us to get as much information as possible and have a dialogue with the people that are opposing and supporting this legislation, so that we can understand all of the facts. I didn't put this agenda together. I didn't create this number of bills on this agenda and generate the number of people coming to testify either. So I please don't hold me responsible for the fact that there's 80 people waiting. That's not my fault. I do want to respect them, and I will, refrain from engaging in more questions, although I have dozens more questions for these particular witnesses. I'll just close by saying that I do disagree, and I think that a lot of the rhetoric that we heard in the testimony is more political than the people on the dais here. Using words like draconian and disparate bargaining power, et cetera. That's all fluff. The fact of the matter is that it's a very progressive and socialist view to suggest that the government should interfere in private agreements among citizens. That's what's draconian, not the voluntary agreement between willing participants. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you. Next, I will recognize Representative Hughes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just two quick comments or questions to especially Director Gerstein. You mentioned something about that